Be turning to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. It's easy to find. It's right before 2 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter number 8. I want to speak to you today on the subject of a new old anthem. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, something important is going on here. The Apostle Paul was writing a letter to the Christians of Israel. He was writing this letter to a church, to a group of Christians that were part of the nation of Israel. And in this letter, he writes one verse that, I kid you not, in my mind, it's almost as though that verse was written thousands and thousands of years ago. It was written and should be taken out as though it was written yesterday for America. This is a statement that therein lies the healing, the cure, and the fixing of all troubles that are in our nation. Now, I want to be very clear this morning. I'm very proud to be American. I'm proud to say we live in the greatest nation on earth. We have been blessed more than any group of people on earth, and there ain't no place I'd rather be than right here. At the same time, you know that there is a tide shifting in our country, and I'm fearful of that tide. I want you to listen to what the Apostle Paul said to the nation of Israel, and think of it as though he was saying it, because he is, and he was. You remember, God wrote this to last all of time. It's just as applicable then as it is now, or now as it is then. So listen to what the Apostle Paul said to this group of Christians that made up Israel. 1 Corinthians chapter number 8 and verse number 9. He said, "But take heed, lest by any means this liberty of yours become a them that are weak." The word weak in the Greek there means unlearned, untaught. He said, take heed, lest by any means this liberty, this freedom of yours become a stumbling block to them that are unlearned, that are weak. Paul was saying to them, Israel is changing. And we're changing because of this new freedom that we found in Christ. We're changing because of this Christianity that we have found. And he said, we've got to be careful. We've got to take heed of this freedom that we've been given, because if we don't, it may... We all know we're living in what was started as a Christian nation. As a Christian nation. Paul said, take heed. God's word uses the exact right word that has all the meaning and the power and the purpose behind it. That word, take heed, you see, has with it two meanings. The first meaning is this: it is to remember with urgency. In other words, it implies that there is a warning. It implies that there is a consequence. Take heed. We need to very carefully remember about this freedom that we've got. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm scared to death that in the United States today we have forgotten a lot of things. We have forgotten a lot of things. So much to the point that whether or not you know it or not, just a couple of days ago, in fact, it was July the 2nd, is now National Forgetting Day. Did you know that? We had a national holiday What would that have been, Friday? Yeah, Friday. Friday was a national holiday in America, the National Forgetting Day. And I think it pretty well suits because I see a nation of remember what got you there. You better remember who provided you this freedom or you're going to fall. Paul said, but take heed, lest by any means this liberty of yours. He said, you've been given freedom. This freedom is yours. This liberty is yours. Paul said, you better take heed and not forget the cost that gave you that freedom. Paul was speaking to them about Jesus Christ dying on the cross and providing that freedom. And absolutely every single one of us here had better always remember that cost. But I'm going to tell you another cost we better remember, and that's the cost of that liberty that you're getting, the cost of that freedom that you enjoyed this weekend, the cost of the freedom for you to go and do whatever you want to today. That freedom wasn't free. That freedom cost. And we better not ever forget that freedom wasn't free. See, the truth of the matter is that as Americans, we have enjoyed more advantages and blessings than 90% of all other human race combined. If you don't believe that, you don't know much that goes on outside Marshall County. Paul said, you better remember what your freedom cost. There were 56 men that signed the Declaration of Independence. All 56 were tried in a court of law and found guilty for treason. The penalty of treason was hanging. Of those 56 men, 5 of them were captured and tortured before being executed for signing their name. 12 of them had their homes burned to the ground and lost everything they had and died absolutely broke and poor without anything. 2 of them had sons that died during the Revolutionary War. 2 of them had sons that were captured by the British. 9 themselves enlisted in the battle and fought and died in the war. And a number of them lost everything they had because they had to remain on the run as the British sent spies into this new America to find these 56 men. One reportedly was standing at the bedside of his dying wife and had to run out the back door and left his wife and 13 children, never to see them again. Why? Because freedom's not free. Freedom's not free. I don't know if you realize this, but there has been 1,284,684 men and women that have worn the uniform of the United States that gave it all that we might have freedom. The cost is not free. Freedom is not free. This liberty was earned in blood that we might have, get this, per our forefathers, a Christian nation. Paul said, you better urgently remember. Because if you forget, if July the 2nd becomes our big holiday in July, if we forget, then we will fall. He said, you better take heed about this liberty, that this freedom wasn't free, and that there was a great cost of blood that was given that we might enjoy what we're enjoying today. And he said, you better do this, because if we don't, then let me make this personal. We become the generation that messed it up. We become the face of the people that couldn't hold on to freedom. We become the ones that forgot what got us here. We become the ones that let the heirloom of freedom that has been passed on by blood after blood after blood, we're the ones that let it go. He said, if we don't do this, then we become a stumbling block to the weak, the unlearned. Do you understand what Paul was saying? Paul was saying, if we don't teach the truths of this liberty and hold fast to it, it will cause us to fall. We won't make it. We won't make it. It's our responsibility as Christians, because this was formed to be a Christian nation. It is our responsibility as Christians that we hold on to the fundamental truths that we were designed to be a Christian-free nation. That our forefathers envisioned one nation under God. That they lived by the motto, in God we trust, not nothing else. Just God's all we need. If we could just get back to teaching our kids, we don't need social correctness. We don't need political correctness. Let me tell you what we need. We need God. That was their motto. In God we trust. The British are coming. We got God coming. In God we trust. Their belief was that all men were created equal by God. I'm going to tell you something. Nothing truer's ever been said. If we don't get back to teaching that the only reason America is great is because of God, if we leave God, we leave the blessing. 4 of you agreed with it. If we leave God, we leave the blessing. The only reason we've got what we got ain't because of politics. It ain't because of senators and representatives. It ain't even because of us. It's because God blessed us. We leave God, we leave the blessing. I'm going to tell you, we need to get back to fighting to keep it the way that our forefathers fought to gain it. Because if we don't, we're going to lose it all. I fear that we've lost the meaning of our national anthem.
There was a lawyer once. His name was Francis Scott Key. He penned a song that I'm sure you're aware of. You've seen it. It's in most hymnals throughout our churches. It's called the National Anthem. It is our song as an American. We go, however, to a ball game. We stand in our church services and we sing the words of that song, and they float over our minds and our lips, and we don't even realize what we're singing. Most of us have memorized it as a child, but we've never really thought about what it means. Let me tell you a story. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer in Baltimore. The colonies were engaged in vicious conflict with the mother country, Britain. Because of this conflict and the protractedness of it, they had accumulated prisoners on both sides. The American colonies had prisoners and the British had prisoners. And the American government initiated a move. They went to the British and they said, let us negotiate for the release of these prisoners. They said, we want to send a man out to discuss this with you. They were holding the American prisoners in boats about 1,000 yards offshore. And they said, we want to send a man by the name of Francis Scott Key. He will come out and negotiate to see if we can make a mutual exchange. On the appointed day, in a rowboat, he went out to this boat and he negotiated with the British officials. And they reached a conclusion that men could be exchanged on a one-for-one basis. Francis Scott Key, jubilant with the fact that he'd been successful, went down below in the boats, and what he found was a cargo hold full of humanity, men. And he said, men, I've got news for you tonight. You're free. He said, tonight I have negotiated successfully your return to the colonies. He said, you'll be taken out of this boat, out of this filth, out of your chains. As he went back up on board to arrange for their passage to the shore, the admiral came and he said, we have a slight problem. He said, we will still honor our commitment to release these men, but it'll be merely academic after tonight. It won't matter. And Francis Scott Key said, what do you mean? He said, well, Mr. Key, he said, tonight we have laid an ultimatum upon the colonies. Your people will either capitulate and lay down the colors of that flag that you think so much of, or you see that fort right over there, Fort Henry? He said, we're going to remove it from the face of the earth. He said, how are you going to do that? He said, if you will, scan the horizon of the sea. And as he looked, he could see hundreds of little dots. And he said, that's the entire British war fleet. He said, all of the gunpowder, all of the armament is being called upon to demolish that fort. It will be here within striking distance in a matter of about 2.5 hours. He said, the war is over. These men would be free anyway. He said, you can't shell that fort. He said, that's a large fort. He said, it's full of women and children. He says, it's predominantly not a military fort. He said, don't worry about it. They said, we've left them a way out. And he said, what's that? He said, do you see that flag way up on the rampart? He said, we have told them that if they will lower that flag, the shelling will stop immediately. And we'll know that they've surrendered, and you'll now be under British rule. Francis Scott Key went down below and told the men what was about to happen. And they said, how many ships? He said, hundreds. The ships got closer. Francis Scott Key went back up on top and he said, men, I'll shout down to you what's going on as we watch. As twilight began to fall, and as the haze hung over the ocean as it does at sunset, suddenly the British war fleet unleashed. He says the sound was deafening. There were so many guns that there were no reliefs. He said it was absolutely impossible to talk or hear. He said suddenly the sky, although dark, was suddenly lit. And he says from down below, all he could hear the men, the prisoners, saying was, tell us where the flag is. What have they done with the flag? Is the flag still flying over the rampart? Tell us. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours into the shelling, every time the bomb would explode and it would be close to the flag, they could see the flag in the illuminated red glare of that bomb. And Francis Scott Key would report down to the men below, it's still up. It's not down. The admiral came and he said, your people are insane. He said, what's the matter with them? He said, don't they understand this is an impossible situation? Francis Scott Key said he remembered what George Washington had said. He said the thing that sets the American Christian apart from all other people in the world is he will die on his feet before he'll live on his knees. The admiral said, we have now instructed all of the guns to focus on the rampart to take that flag down. He said, we don't understand something. Our reconnaissance tells us that that flag has been hit directly again and again and again, and yet it's still flying. We don't understand that. But he said, now we're about to bring every gun for the next 3 hours to bear on that point. Francis Scott Key said the barrage was unmerciful. All that he could hear was the men down below praying. The prayer, God, keep that flag flying where we last saw it. Sunrise came. He said there was a heavy mist hanging over the land, but the rampart was tall enough. There stood the flag, completely nondescript, in shreds. The flagpole itself was at a crazy angle, but the flag was still at the top. Francis Scott Key went aboard and immediately went into Fort Henry to see what had happened. And what he'd found had happened was that that flagpole and that flag had suffered repetitious direct hits. And when it had fallen, but men, fathers, who knew what it meant for that flag to be on the ground, although knowing that all of the British guns were trained on it, walked over and held it up humanly until they died. Their bodies were removed and others took their place. Francis Scott Key said what held that flagpole in place at that unusual angle were patriots' bodies. He penned the song, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? Or the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet fly and wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? The debt was demanded. The price, it was paid.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets spread clear, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
I'd like to read to you a statement. Freedom is never more than one generation away from being extinct. We didn't pass it on to our children through the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to them to do the same. Or one day we'll be telling our children what it was once like in America, when men were free. Ronald Reagan. There are many of you here today that have donned the uniform to fight for the freedom of this nation, to be a Christian nation. That's what our forefathers wanted it to be. Now it's time that we all respond to the call of arms. We have all been placed in the army of God. We are all soldiers and ambassadors for the cause of Christ. And you've all been called upon to join the battle. What is it we are to do to win this battle? One, as Paul said, it's important that we teach it. That we teach it to our children. That we teach it to our grandchildren. That it is urgently important to remember. That it is urgently imperative that we not forget freedom was not free. That we live it. That we live in a way that we believe that we are one nation under God. That all men are created equal. That in God we trust is our motto. We need to live it from the pulpit to the polls. We've got to believe it. God's word says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then and only then will I hear from heaven. And I will forgive their sins and I will heal their land. You want to tell me you want me to tell you how you can fight for this freedom? By getting on your knees and believing God is all we need. By believing that it is in God that we trust. By humbling ourselves and praying and seeking and turning from our wicked ways and seeking God to heal our land. I don't want to be that last generation. I don't want it to be my face that let this freedom slip away, that we might live in a Christian nation. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you got on your knees and said, oh God, it's you I trust. God, you are the only answer our land needs. God, please heal our land. I'm going to ask if you would to bow your heads. And if God has spoke to your heart, you slip out of your seat right now. Answer the call to arms. Answer this war cry, the battle cry. Answer the trumpet and come and kneel and say, God, heal our land. That we be truly one God, one nation under God.